I came back. I said, I'm ready to come back to Loudon. I'd lived in Chattanooga and Knoxville, tried that. I actually went to Washington, D.C., and did some political stuff there and didn't like it. So I said, I'm ready to go back to the small town where I grew up. And I asked my Uncle John Greer, said, can I have a job? And he said, you haven't, something about sowing oats, not sowing enough oats, but he said, you aren't mature enough, basically, to come back in this business. And you can't just come here and have a job because you're a family member. So I said, well, what are you saying? In other words, you won't hire me? He said, no, you go out and work in this business somewhere else, and if you like it, then we'll move ahead. If you don't like it, if it's not for you, then you won't waste our time and yours. I said, that's a good idea. So my dad didn't know it, but I didn't have a college degree yet. I still had some courses to take, and he had finished paying for my education. So I was on my own. So I was working 2 or 3 jobs at a time. I was working selling tickets for the Shrine Circus in a boiler room on Clinch Avenue in Knoxville. Then I was working at nights at Bailoff's clothing store in Westtown Mall, trying to make enough money to pay for my last couple of courses. He got my degree in American Studies, which basically all my English lit, all my history, all my things I'd taken, I somehow got a degree. Then after Uncle John said, well, working in a clothing store or selling circus tickets isn't going to give you an experience, I went to Sturkey Brothers down on Gay Street in Knoxville. That was not only their main store, but their corporate offices were upstairs. And I went there and got a job as a commissioned salesperson early in 1974. Worked there. Actually had Big John Tate, heavyweight champion of the world, as a customer. Got to meet the big boys that were in the corporate situation for the Sturkey Brothers chain, and loved furniture and mattresses. Really loved selling it. And so after that, after doing that for a while, I came back and worked for Greer's. That's probably why I loved the furniture and mattress, in the home furnishings end of it. Didn't care so much for the hardware and appliance and part, and that's why when my dad and uncle stepped aside and let me have it, I pretty much tried to push it more into the home furnishings and away from the other parts.
So what year did you begin work here?
I came here in November of 1976.
Okay.
And so I've been at this now for a long time.
A little while.
Yes.
Yeah.
So don't know how to do anything else.
Why do you think Greer's has been able to stay in business now for over 133 years?
Well, that's, boy, you just fed me a loaded question that pardon me if being the salesman that I am, I answered in a selling manner, but we do everything great. No, frankly, the what's been passed down from generation to generation, when I get away from those principles that the previous 3 generations insisted upon, the business starts failing. When I adhere to those principles, we do well. So in 1890, when John G. Greer started this business, his motto was the best way to avoid a misunderstanding is to first have a firm understanding, which means with your employees, with your customers. Don't beat around the bush, which is frankly one of my weaknesses. I talk too much. I'm not clear. I act like a politician. I throw out that gray area in trying to please everybody. But whenever I fail in those ways, we go back and we've got it posted on the counter. The best way to avoid a misunderstanding is to first have a firm understanding. And that was when you talk about the UT football team's maxims. That's one of them. Another one is inspect what you expect. And so you can delegate to your employees. You can give them plenty of leash and freeway to run their own department, but you must inspect what you expect. Another one is MBWA. I learned that was management by walking around. And so you walk around the store and you see you hopefully find somebody doing something right, and you praise them. You reinforce that. And if you find them doing something wrong, there's sort of you know, if you can give out 3 pieces of praise for good things, then you've built up you've built up points, you've built up dollars in your bank that you can now criticize them for what they did wrong, and let them know that that's not all you do is just sit around griping. So but the big thing that I think has been passed down from generation to generation is buy good, acceptable name brands, not the super expensive stuff, not the dirt cheap stuff. Well accepted name brands, and we do that, and display them properly, sell them at a fair price. And because John Greer paid for these buildings 100 years ago, our overhead's a lot lower than the Knoxville stores, and that's allowed us to be very price competitive. But then the big thing is standing behind it, and that's probably that's very much more difficult in today's era because Barksdale Greer bought the old Lutz Mantle factory, Lutz Manufacturing Company, over on the river. It's where the white condos are now, below the senior center. But that was our big service department, and he kept 2 men repairing appliances, 2 men repairing televisions full time. He had 2 men, Ivan Worley and Ted Smallin, doing small engine repair, and then all sorts of other. So they had a service department. They could stand behind the product. We lost a lot of those great men that repaired back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and had to close the service department. We sold that old warehouse, so it's much more difficult now to stand behind it. Fortunately, we lined up service companies that will do the work. But that's the formula to success. That's why Greer's has persevered all these years: is sell good name brands, sell them at a competitive price, and then stand behind it and do whatever it takes to make the customer happy.
Characters who've worked for Greer's. Does anybody pop off the noggin?
Well, I was in the basement of this store, in the part that was built in 1914 by Bliss Carmichael. There's an old bomb shelter that I guess they put together under the steps there for the I guess World War II or during the Cold War or something. And my dad's got the key to that, even though he's retired. And I don't think I've got a key, but he keeps some of the relics. I mean, you can find the old barrels that had the saltine crackers in them down there. But also there are things like Uncle Dick Thompson's toolbox. It goes back to the 1940s, I guess. But my dad said, we're never throwing that away. Now, when you say characters, there's funny characters, but there's also some people that had character. On the wall over here, we have the picture of Bill Isbell, who Bill Isbell in 1939, Bill Isbell and Bob Hudson were working here as young 18 or 19-year-old truck drivers, handymen, whatever was needed. My Uncle Barksdale Greer, he was the bachelor, had no children, of course, but he thought those 2 boys were like his sons. World War II came along, and Bob Hudson went off to the Pacific. Bill Isbell went off to Europe. Bill Isbell was killed in France, and it tore my uncle up. It just, I mean, he cried too much and drank too much for about a year, and admitted it in his letters to Bob Hudson, telling him, don't let the Japanese kill you, or I think I'll have to kill myself. They were like his sons. So Uncle Bart insisted that we keep that picture of Bill Isbell on the wall, and we will do that as long as there's a Greer's. So he was not what I would call a character, but he was a man of character, as was Bob Hudson, who came back from World War II and spent his entire career here as Greer's credit manager. I mean, up until pretty much the day he died, and his wife, Kathleen, that's Bernard Courtney's sister, ran our office for us. So they were people of great character that Greer's didn't have to worry about the office, because nobody was going to steal from us, and credit was administered fairly by handshake. And the thing I remember about Bob Hudson was you'd come in, and a farmer would come in from Piney and say, well, I need a sofa. Can I sign for it? Can you get me approved? He said, well, yeah. He said, he said, you don't have to sign for it. He said, well, what's my monthly payments? He said, I know what you do. He said, you come pay me when your tobacco crop comes in. I bet I heard that 30 times. You don't have monthly payments. I know that you work hand to fist, that every dollar you make at your regular job goes to feed your family. You can't make a payment, but when your tobacco crop comes in, I know you'll come in and pay me, and that's what they would do. That was an era of trust that.
Sure, handshake.
Yes. So characters. Well, Jim Watts was quite a character. Jim Watts ran the hunting and fishing department, and people loved him. And I was talking to Ricky Love last night. He said, I went down and bought a roll of BBs on credit as a kid. Jim Watts let me have credit, but Jim Watts could tell some terrible stories, and he most of them you can't repeat. And he was quite a fella. Had a pencil thin mustache. One day he would get here early and had a key to the store and would sweep all the way down to the White Store, which is now Shops on the Square. And one day he had left they had a plumbing display in the front window. Johnny King was a character that rode a tricycle all over town. Johnny King saw the door was open, saw that there was plumbing in the front window, and he came in and used one of the toilets after he'd had his morning coffee. And Jim Watts came back in and discovered the evidence, and he stopped leaving the door open. Scrapper Johnson worked in the hardware. He was quite a character. Scrapper was a part-time fireman. I assume he got the name Scrapper because he was quite a fighter. There was Brownie Holt. One day, John Greer looked out and saw our delivery truck going up the highway and saw some kid just hanging off the back of the truck. Said, "Good Lord, that kid's going to get killed." And Gene Robinson was his uncle. Gene Robinson was our truck driver. Gene said, "Well, that's my nephew. He just wanted to drive along and help me." And he said, "Well, either give him a job and get him on the payroll, but tell him to quit riding on the back of the truck." And Brownie Holt proceeded to be in management, could fix anything, was another character, still alive today. And one of the Holt brothers, Gene Robinson, and Ed Ballard. Ed Ballard was from Knoxville, from the rough parts of what they call Happy Holler in North Knoxville, but married a Watkins girl here and moved to Loudon. Ed had a club foot and a big raised shoe that he had. He had a limp. And Gene Robinson, that was Brownie's uncle, Gene Robinson had polio, I think. And and so Gene had a limp, and the two of them could carry a sofa up the stairs and limp in unison. They had it down pat.
Now Gene played fiddle also, didn't
he? Gene Robinson played clawhammer banjo and old-time fiddle. And my brothers and I learned a lot going out to Gene's on Sunday afternoons and picking parties and learning some of those old time songs, just like we did at your father's Sunday afternoon jam. So yeah, Gene was a fun musician. Other characters, I'll be brief. Frank Quinn, who owned the funeral home, and we all know the legend of Frank Quinn. But somewhere during the Depression, I guess he had to. Frank Quinn was in danger of losing the funeral home, so Mr. McCrary, a businessman in Philadelphia, and Don P. Smith, that ran the chair factory, and Barksdale Greer helped put up the money so that Loudon wouldn't lose a funeral home. And Mr. Quinn worked off some of that debt by, when he didn't have a funeral, working here at Greer's. Essentially, that meant sitting by the old wood stove and talking to people as they came in. Had an iron grip, and he would. But the one thing he would do was he would, on Saturdays, one Saturday a month, they would take all the stuff they couldn't sell and put it out on a flatbed truck. That Evans Brothers Bluegrass Band from Paint Rock would come in and play on that flatbed truck and gather a crowd. But back then, on Saturdays, in the 50s and whatnot, on Saturdays, you didn't have to gather a crowd because Loudon sidewalks were full of people shopping and just enjoying their weekend. So the Evans Brothers would gather the crowd, and then Mr. Quinn would go out and auction off all the stuff, and it was a fun event. I barely remember it. One more. I mean, we had. You could go on and on and on, but Nanny Markham. Nanny Markham was lived right over here on Poplar Street. She was sort of had a deep voice for a lady, and she basically her job, and she and Belle Worley was to keep the store looking pretty and clean and put up stock and feather dust and whatnot. But Nanny just had that gruff voice, and really, when you talk about a firm understanding and avoiding a misunderstanding, she always cut to the chase, and she said what was on her mind, which sometimes wasn't politically correct around a customer, but said, "Why did you say that?" And Nanny said, "Well, why not?" And so she was one of our great characters. Ivan Worley, Belle Worley, great family. You know of them through your family. I could go on and on. I mean, there's been 5 generations passing through these doors that some were characters, some were not. Bill Varner, great cook, would rather cook or hang out with his Legion or his veteran buddies than do anything else. But we had some real storytellers, and I guess I've benefited from that and learned from that here at the store.
Well, you've started the Bo Carey Loudon historical tours back a few years ago, right?
A few years, not too long ago.
So, how did this come up? How did you get this thing started?
The Clayton Pangle was the director of the Loudon County Visitors Bureau, and Claire Kimmy was on the board. I was on the board of directors, and that was to promote tourism. And Claire was a publisher and a graphic designer, and they said, we could, Loudon Historic District, it'd be great if we had a self-guided brochure, self-guided tour of historic downtown Loudon and do a brochure. So they assigned me to do to draw up the brochure, do the research, get the dates, the locations, the old buildings and whatnot, and then get Claire one day to take the pictures, and they approved a budget, $1,000 or so, to create this brochure. Well, I procrastinated. I played with it, and I said, no, I can't get it right. And then once I thought I had everything down, the trees were full and you couldn't see the houses. You had to wait till winter. And I procrastinated some more, and then I found out that some of my research was wrong. And frankly, I just never got the brochure right. And they waited 3 or 4 years for it. And they said, well, Bo, why don't you do a trial run? Just do a tour yourself.
Yeah.
Well, I can do that. Now, I can do that all day long. I'm just not doing very good at the finished product here. And so on a Saturday afternoon, I took 2 or 3 ladies that were, I guess, board members of the Visitors Bureau, and we walked around town, and I talked, and they made good criticism, constructive suggestions on, well, you can do it better, you can do it. The whole idea was still just to go back and write the brochure. Well, never did it. So just did this history tour over and over and over, and people started coming, and I wasn't charging for it, and people started showing interest, and at some point it started to maybe take away from both the job and the family. That people were saying, well, we've got our relatives in from Michigan out here in Tellico Village, can you do a tour Thursday afternoon? And I would leave the store, maybe not totally staffed, to do it. Is it okay to go ahead and get into the ghost tour part?
That was going to be my...
Okay, but that gets us through the history tour. Just started doing it on a voluntary basis, taking friends, and then anybody that asked to do it, we would go around town, look at almost 20 different sites. That and I'll have to admit, the bulk of that, my information came from the historic landmarks of Loudon County. That was originally a DAR publication, but Joe Spence and George Kiley edited it, did a magnificent job, and that was really the source of my information.
So do you think there is any ghost in Loudon?
I am a Christian. I believe in the great spirit above. I've always laughed about ghost stories, but
what's your favorite ghost story you heard around
my
here?
favorite ghost story would be the one that's about Path Killer. The biggest part of my ghost stories came from a fellow named Bub Morris. Bub Morris was a storyteller. He was the two greatest storytellers I know of here in Loudon were Frank Buddy Robinson and Bub Morris. And Bub gave me two or three great ones. One about the old Cox Cafe, which is now the General Store Antiques, and how some weird things. So I've been doing history tours and never thought about ghost tours until Bub and others started telling me some very mysterious things. So to your question, my favorite ghost story is the one at the old Blair Storehouse, which was right there on Main Street, which the Blair family would have built around 1928, two-story brick house. Years later, we know that Path Killer probably had possession of it, and we had possession of the ferry, and that he alternated owning it with the Blairs. And at some point, I guess in the past century, the Arp family ran a grocery there. It was known as the Arp Grocery, just a small town grocery. And the Arp family related to the current owner, Donna Seward, that they had seen a ghost in that building. And they said, they described it to Donna as follows, that this ghost would come from the rear corner of the Arp Grocery of the building, or it might come from upstairs. And it would come over and sit in the front window, looking back down towards Blair's Ferry, or the ferry that he once owned. Said it was a dark, swarthy little man, and which makes us think that could be the ghost of Path Killer, bemoaning the loss of his fortune, his waterfront, his ferry, his storehouse that he supposedly appears in. So I thought, okay, that's a great story to tell on a ghost tour. Until one night, just a year ago, Halloween about a year ago, 2022, some adult ladies that were sisters that lived in what we used to call Mexico, but down on down around the waterfront. They were on the tour, and they said, we saw that guy through the window when we were girls playing around here. We saw him through the shutters of that one window where you're saying it happened. And that's when I got the chills on my arms and the goosebumps, and just thought, well, there's some verification. I guess I'll keep telling this story. So that's my favorite one.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe not the best one, but the
that
favorite.
is a good one. There are several stories that you tell on your tours that are good. But tell me the one about the romance story about the Blair.
So the original ferry keeper that Blair's Ferry is named for, James Blair, lived on the north side of the river, and the Blairs had huge farmlands there. And he had 4 or 5 sons. The couple of the older sons probably got more of the business, the ferry and some of a lot of the farm property. Hugh, on the other hand, was growing up, and he had not married like his brothers had, but he was dating Nancy Johnston, who lived on the south side of the river, near the shore of the river, and Hugh lived on his dad's farm on the north side, near where Viscase and Tate and Lyle industries are now. He would get in his rowboat there in the early 1800s, and row across the Tennessee River every day. Probably at the end of the workday, he would row across the river and court Nancy Johnston in her home. And after doing this for a couple of years, he proposed marriage. Well, Nancy responded that she did love Hugh Blair, but she could never marry until her ill father had passed away. She was living with her sick father, taking care of him, nursing him, and she was loyal to her father. And she just said, Hugh, I hope that this won't run you off, but I cannot marry as long as I'm responsible to him first. That did not deter Hugh Blair. He continued to paddle across the river every evening and court Nancy every evening, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Virtually every day he would paddle across that river and court Nancy. Finally, much later, Mr. Johnston passed away, and Nancy said to Hugh, "If you still want me, I will marry you." The only problem was, by now they were basically senior citizens. This had gone on for a long, long time. This is why I refer to it as Loudon's greatest love story. It is absolutely Loudon's greatest love story. So Hugh proposed, and he had property over back on the Blair side of the river. He wanted to build her a home as a wedding present. The only problem was he was too feeble and up in the years to build the home himself as he would have done in the past. So he basically made his nephew, Dr. James Blair, the overseer, the general contractor, whatever you want to call it, and he built the house. Hugh named it Yonside, Yonside, in reverence to that daily rowing across the river on the yon side. He had courted this woman on the yon side of the river, and now she had moved to the yon side to live with him. And she did live with him, and they both died there in the old yon side home. Today that home exists. It was the Economic Development Office for many years. It was physically moved, I guess, at the time that Viscase was built in the 50s, just a little bit on down the road in the industrial park, just beyond what's now Tate and Lyle. It still sits there.
Wow.
It needs to be preserved because the Economic Development Office no longer takes care of it. But that is Loudon's greatest love story. They are buried next to each other in the old Sticky Cemetery, Hugh and Nancy Johnston Blair.
So about how old were they when they did get married?
That's, I think 60s.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that. I need to know that and be able to really. We could probably determine how long. I think he was Loudon's first postmaster, but I'm not sure.
I think
don't want to hazard a guess, but I want to think it was not just months and a couple of years. It was many years of courting.
Wow.
Loyalty.
If you could go back to any other era and live in Loudon, what do you think it would be?
Most definitely the 1850s. My favorite period, and people that hear me talk or go on my tours probably tire of me, my OCD, my just going on and on about the 1850s. But it was absolutely Loudon's most profitable, most advanced age, and that's simply because the railroad coming up from Georgia ended in Loudon, pretty much where the Highway 11 bridge is now, and they would turn the engine around and send it back. Because of that dynamic, the water and rail, and us being we became a big riverfront town, and we became a big railroad town, and we had 5 hotels because all those passengers had to get off the train and get on a steamboat or a riverboat. All that cargo had to get off the freight trains or get on the freight trains from the water. And so we had a huge wharf town. Wiley Blair was the entrepreneur that sold the plots and developed it. And this town, we had a daily newspaper. It was actually the O'Brien brothers, who were Governor Brownlow's nephews. And they had a daily newspaper. We had a college. We had a dance school. We had all sorts of mills. This town was growing in leaps and bounds, and mostly, especially along the waterfront and along the railroad. Wharf Street developed into just a phenomenal business district, and 3 or 4 of those old buildings from the 1850s still stand today. So it had to be an exciting time. It is where the story about the marrying Wilsons came about, and that's another story. But lots of people prospered in Loudon. The sad part is that when we were growing so fast in the 1850s, after the Civil War and the decimation and the destruction and death, Loudon only had maybe 100 or so people in it. It went from feast to famine in a short time.
Well, the other day I got to go along with your tour with about 35 people, I think, from Tellico Village. So we're going to now watch a little clip at the Thomas Jefferson Mason House. And then I'll have her to...
Was one of those successful riverboat captains during the 1850s boom time of Loudon. So finally, around late 1850s, he started building this wonderful house. It was going to be a big two-story brick house. Had the bricks all sitting out there, and then before he knew it, the Yankee, that's the Y word, I'm sorry, politically incorrect, the Union troops took the bricks and took them up on Fort Hill, right up here, to use for their fortifications. Now, so happens Thomas Jefferson Mason was a Union sympathizer, so he couldn't just get extremely mad. He donated to the cause, but his builder was pretty hacked off, Osborne. And the folklore, we've never proven this, but it's been written, is that his sort of giving it back to the Union was to build those upper balconies in the shape of the Stars and Bars Confederate flag. See that? Now this whole dynamic of North and South changes. His family, his daughter Eliza married a McQueen, and the McQueens lived in this property for another 140 years or so. 2 doors down, Ruth McQueen is in a historic home, and I'm going to take a freebie here, Dan. It's a tour that's not on our menu. It's a home tour. Any of you ladies want to do a home tour, Ruth will host us. She married into that McQueen family. She'll host us in her place and do a great little historical. She dresses up in period outfit. If you ever want to do that, let me know. So finally, after 140 years of the McQueens and Masons living here, it went up for auction. And who buys it? A lady from Kalamazoo, Michigan, of all things.